The flour hung in the air like ghost light, suspended in the yellow glow of a single bulb that had been burning since 3:47 in the morning. The bakery was not yet a bakery at this hour. It was a workshop, a furnace room, a place where a woman's hands moved through dough the way a sculptor's moved through clay, with violence and precision in equal measure. The countertops were scarred white marble, older than the building itself, hauled from a demolished church on 9th Street, back when the neighborhood still had churches. The walls were bare brick, the mortar crumbling in places, patched with a paste she mixed herself from flour and epoxy because the landlord had never once sent a repair crew in 4 years. The oven was a refurbished Blodgett from 1987 that she had rebuilt twice with parts ordered from a man in Newark who didn't ask questions and didn't take credit cards. It ran hot on the left side. She compensated. She always compensated. Her name was Elena Vasile, and she had been standing since before the sun remembered this part of the city existed. Her hands were dusted white to the wrists, her forearms roped with the kind of lean muscle that comes not from a gym, but from years of kneading, lifting, carrying, surviving. Her dark hair was pulled back and pinned with a severity that suggested a woman who had no time for mirrors, and even less for vanity. There was flour on her jaw. There was flour on the collar of her black cotton shirt. There was a scar on her left hand, between the thumb and forefinger, from a bread knife that had slipped during a 16-hour shift 3 Christmases ago, when she had filled an order for 400 dinner rolls for a women's shelter and charged them nothing. She was 34 years old. She looked like someone who had lived every single day of those years standing up. The dough beneath her palms was ciabatta. It required a wet, loose handling that most bakers avoided because it was messy and unpredictable, prone to collapsing if you overworked it, prone to turning dense if you underworked it. She did neither. Her rhythm was metronomic, born from 10,000 repetitions. Fold, stretch, quarter turn, fold, stretch, quarter turn. And her breathing matched the motion, slow and steady, the kind of breathing a distance runner uses at mile 18, not because they are calm, but because they have trained their body to lie about its exhaustion. The radio on the shelf behind her played something low and indistinct, more static than music, a murmur that filled the silence without disturbing it. Outside, Brewer Street was still dark. This was not a neighborhood that woke early. It was a neighborhood that stayed up late and paid for it. A 4-block stretch of old brick and older money where the storefronts changed names every 18 months, but the ownership never changed at all. The laundromat on the corner belonged to a man who had never washed his own clothes. The barber shop 2 doors down was open 3 days a week and somehow paid rent that would have bankrupted a law firm. The bodega across the street had security cameras that pointed not at the register but at the sidewalk, recording who came and went, cataloging faces the way a customs agent catalogs passports. Everyone on Brewer Street knew who owned these things. Everyone on Brewer Street knew who owned Brewer Street. And Elena Vasile, who had signed her lease 4 years ago with a handshake and a check made out to a holding company with a name that meant nothing, knew it too. She simply did not care. She made bread. Bread did not negotiate. Bread did not politics. Bread rose, or it didn't, based on chemistry and effort and time, and no amount of money or menace could make a sourdough starter behave if the hydration was wrong. The front door was still locked. The closed sign faced outward, hand-painted on a piece of reclaimed barnwood that she had sanded herself. The display case was empty, its glass freshly cleaned, waiting for the first loaves to emerge at 5:45. The tables, 4 of them, mismatched, scarred, were pushed to the edges of the small dining area like spectators at a ring. She served no coffee. She offered no Wi-Fi. There were no outlets for laptops, no seasonal flavor rotations, no loyalty punch cards. There was bread. There was bread that people drove 40 minutes to buy. There was bread that a food critic from the Times had called, in a single line buried in a paragraph about the borough's evolving palate, the best sourdough he had eaten on American soil, and she had not framed the review, had not printed it, had not even read it until her neighbor showed it to her on a phone screen, and her only response had been to check the oven temperature because the ciabattas had been running 2 degrees cool that week. At 5:15, the first loaves came out. She did not use a timer. She used her nose and the color of the crust, reading the bread the way a sailor reads the sky, not with instruments, but with a lifetime of looking. The sourdough was perfect, its crust a deep mahogany with the kind of blistering that meant the steam injection had hit at exactly the right moment. She set the loaves on the cooling rack with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about her movements, as if the bread, having survived the fire, deserved a soft landing. The smell filled the bakery like a living thing, warm and yeasty and ancient, the smell of civilization itself, of the first thing humans ever learned to make that was more than mere survival. She did not know that 3 blocks south, in a building with no sign and a door that required 2 keys and a code, a man was sitting in a leather chair that cost more than her monthly rent, listening to a voice on the other end of a phone describe a problem. The man's name was not spoken in that room. It was not spoken on Brewer Street either, though everyone knew it. It existed in the neighborhood the way gravity exists, invisible, constant, and capable of pulling everything toward its center without ever being seen. The morning light arrived the way it always arrived on Brewer Street, reluctantly, filtered through the gap between the old textile warehouse and the apartment building on the corner, a thin blade of gold that crossed the sidewalk at an angle and found, every morning at 6:12, the exact center of Elena's front window. She had noticed this on her first day in the space. She had arranged her display case to catch it. The bread, when the light hit, seemed to glow from within, the crusts turning amber, the scoring lines casting tiny shadows that made each loaf look like a topographic map of some beautiful, edible country. It was the only piece of marketing she had ever done, and she had done it with sunlight and geometry. The first customer arrived at 6:30. Mrs. Okonkwo, 71, from the apartment above the barber shop. She came every morning and bought the same thing, 1 round loaf of the sourdough, unsliced, and every morning she said the same thing, which was nothing at all. She placed her money on the counter. Elena placed the bread in a paper bag. They exchanged a nod that contained the entire history of their relationship, which was 4 years of mutual respect expressed through the daily transaction of exceptional bread and exact change. Mrs. Okonkwo left. The bell above the door rang once, a bright copper sound that Elena had chosen specifically because it was the same pitch as the bell in her grandmother's bakery in Cluj-Napoca, a bakery that no longer existed, in a building that was now a mobile phone shop, in a city she had not visited in 11 years. By 7:15, the morning rush had begun. It was not the kind of rush that required a queue system or a number dispenser. It was 6, sometimes 8 people, arriving in a loose, familiar rhythm, each knowing what they wanted, each receiving it with the minimum of conversation. Elena moved behind the counter with an efficiency that bordered on choreography. Reach, wrap, slide, take payment, next. Her face in these moments was not friendly. It was not unfriendly. It was focused, present, operating in a state of flow that left no room for performance. She did not smile at customers because a smile would have been a lie. She was not happy. She was not unhappy. She was working. The bread was the smile. The bread said everything she would not. The black car arrived at 7:42. It did not park. It stopped. There is a difference, and everyone on Brewer Street understood it. A car that parks is looking for a space. A car that stops is claiming one. This car, a Mercedes S-Class, current year, black as a closed eye, stopped directly in front of Elena's bakery, its front tire touching the curb with the precision of a surgeon's incision. The engine continued to run. The windows were tinted beyond the legal limit, that particular shade of obsidian that said the occupants were not hiding from the sun. They were hiding from you. The driver's door opened first. A man emerged who was not the man, but was clearly in service to the man. He was tall, broad, and dressed in a dark suit that had been tailored to accommodate the slight bulge beneath his left arm. He wore an earpiece. He did not look at the bakery. He looked at the street, north, south, roof lines, parked cars, pedestrians, with the kind of systematic scan that is taught, not inherited. His name was Victor, though no one on Brewer Street knew that. What they knew was that when a man like Victor stood on your sidewalk, you found a reason to be somewhere else. He opened the rear passenger door. The man who emerged did not hurry. He did not adjust his jacket or check his phone or orient himself the way people do when they arrive somewhere. He simply stood, and the sidewalk rearranged itself around him. He was not tall, 5'11" at most, but his proportions were those of a structure designed to bear weight. Broad shoulders, a thick chest that tapered to a controlled waist, hands that hung at his sides with the practiced stillness of a man who knew exactly what those hands were capable of and felt no need to demonstrate it. His suit was charcoal, 3-piece, the wool so fine it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His shirt was white. His tie was the exact shade of burgundy that, in certain lights, looked like dried blood. His shoes were black, hand-lasted, the leather catching the morning sun with a low, expensive gleam. His face was a study in controlled geometry, high cheekbones, a jaw that could have been cut from the same marble as Elena's countertops, dark hair silvered at the temples, and combed back with the kind of precision that suggested a man who had not left anything to chance since the day he learned that chance could kill you. His eyes were the problem. His eyes were dark, almost black, set deep beneath a brow that created permanent shadow, and they moved with the slow, deliberate tracking of a predator that has never needed to chase its prey because prey has always come to it. His name was Luca Ferraro. He owned the building Elena's bakery was in. He owned the building next to it. He owned the block. He owned pieces of the borough that did not appear on any public record, but were understood in the quiet economy of Brewer Street to be as surely his as the blood in his veins. He was 46 years old. He had buried his father at 19, his brother at 27, and his conscience at some unspecified point between the two. He was not cruel. Cruelty requires effort, and Luca Ferraro had long since passed the point where anyone required effort to manage. He simply existed at a frequency that rearranged the molecules of the world around him, and the world, having learned, complied. A second man exited the car from the other side, shorter, leaner, younger, with the kind of restless energy that Victor's stillness was designed to counterbalance. He carried a leather portfolio and wore a suit that was trying very hard to be as good as his employer's, and failing in the way that all imitations fail, by being too precise, too deliberate, too aware of itself. His name was Marco, and he functioned as something between an assistant, an advisor, and a translator of Luca's silences into actionable instructions. The three men stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Victor's eyes completed another sweep. Marco checked something on his phone. Luca looked at the bakery. He looked at it the way a man looks at a painting he has owned for years and never truly examined, with a sudden, sharp curiosity that surprised even him. The hand-painted sign, the reclaimed wood, the display case catching the morning light, the bread inside it, glowing. He walked in. The bell rang. That copper note, pitched to the memory of a bakery in Cluj-Napoca, sounded exactly the same for a man who owned the building as it did for Mrs. Okonkwo. Elena was behind the counter, her back half-turned, sliding a tray of baguettes into the rack. She registered the bell. She did not turn immediately. She finished what she was doing because the baguettes needed to be placed at the correct angle for airflow, and airflow did not care who had just walked in. When she turned, she saw three men. She assessed them the way she assessed everything, quickly, practically without sentiment. Suits. Expensive ones. The big one was security. The young one was staff. The one in the middle was the reason the other two existed. She had never met Luca Ferraro. She had never seen his face. She knew his name the way she knew the name of the weather, as a force that affected her daily life, but over which she had no control, and to which she paid the minimum possible attention. She wiped her hands on her apron. She did not speak first. She waited because this was her counter, her shop, her domain, and in this space she set the terms of engagement. Luca's eyes moved over the bakery, the scarred marble, the bare brick, the rebuilt oven with its patched door, the absence of everything unnecessary, no decoration, no branding, no performance, just tools, surfaces, and bread. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, the way tectonic plates shift miles below the surface, invisible, seismic. Marco stepped forward. He had a voice built for intermediation, smooth and modulated, the voice of a man who spent his life saying things on behalf of someone who did not say them himself. "We'd like a moment of your time," he said. "Mr. Ferraro has a matter to discuss regarding the building." Elena looked at Marco, the way she looked at a delivery driver who had brought the wrong flour, with patient, measured disinterest. She was aware, in the way that all business owners in contested territories are aware, that a visit from the landlord's representative was not a social call. It was a measurement. They were measuring her. The shop, the revenue potential, the square footage. They were calculating what this space could be if it were not a bakery that served no coffee and offered no Wi-Fi. "I open in 10 minutes, she said. "You can buy bread or you can come back during business hours." The sentence hung in the air. Victor, near the door, did not move, but his weight shifted almost imperceptibly onto his front foot. Marco's mouth opened, then closed. It was not a response he had a protocol for. People did not set conditions for Luca Ferraro. People received conditions from Luca Ferraro. The idea that a woman with flour on her jaw would tell them to come back during business hours was so far outside the expected behavioral parameters that Marco's internal script simply crashed. Luca said nothing. He looked at Elena. She looked back. Her eyes were gray, the color of winter mornings in a country she no longer talked about, and they held his gaze without challenge, without fear, without anything except a calm, absolute refusal to rearrange her priorities because a man in a suit had walked through her door. She was not being brave. Bravery implies awareness of danger. She was being herself, which was a woman who had been on her feet since before 4 a.m, and had 12 more baguettes to score before the doors opened. And whatever this man wanted, it was not more important than the bread. Luca pulled out a chair. The scrape of its legs against the tile floor was a sound the bakery had heard 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with this particular weight behind it. He sat down. Marco, reading the signal, sat across from him. Victor remained standing by the door, a column of tailored menace. "Sit," Luca said. The word was not directed at his men. It was directed at Elena. It was not a suggestion. It was not a request. It was the kind of imperative that comes from a man who has spent decades in rooms where his words rewrote reality, where sight meant sit and stand meant stand and leave, meant that someone would never be seen on this street again. The word had weight. It had history. It had the accumulated force of 1,000 previous utterances, each one obeyed without question. Elena looked at him. She looked at the chair he had indicated with a barely perceptible tilt of his chin. She looked at the clock on the wall. 7:49, 11 minutes before opening. She looked back at Luca Ferraro, this man whose name operated like weather on her block, and something in her expression shifted. Not fear, not defiance. Something quieter and far more dangerous than either. She turned her back to him. She walked to the counter. She picked up a lame, the razor-sharp scoring blade that bakers use to slash the tops of loaves before they enter the oven, and she began to score the baguettes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 swift angled cuts per loaf, each one executed with the precision of a calligrapher, the blade moving through the taut skin of the dough with a sound like silk tearing. She did not look at him. She did not acknowledge the command. She moved through the remaining loaves with the unhurried focus of a woman who had decided, without drama or declaration, that the word sit, when spoken by a stranger in her own shop, was simply a sound. A sound with no more authority than the bell above the door, or the static on the radio, or the hum of the oven that she had rebuilt with her own hands. Luca Ferraro sat in a chair in a bakery he owned, in a building he owned, on a block he owned, and watched a woman ignore him. Victor's eyes cut to Marco. Marco's eyes cut to Luca. No one in this formation had a response cued. The silence expanded. It filled the bakery like the smell of bread, warm and pervasive, and impossible to escape. Luca's hands rested on his thighs. His right thumb moved once across the fabric of his trousers. A gesture so small that only someone trained to read him would have noticed it. Victor noticed it. It was the gesture Luca made when something unexpected had captured his full attention. Not his anger, not his irritation, his attention. The complete, focused engagement of a mind that had not been genuinely surprised by another human being in years. Elena finished scoring the last baguette. She slid the tray into the oven. She set the temperature by feel, adjusting the dial 2 degrees to the right to compensate for the hot spot. She closed the oven door. She washed her hands at the sink, taking her time, working the flour from beneath her fingernails with a small brush. She dried her hands on a clean towel. She folded the towel. She placed it precisely where it belonged. Then she walked toward the front of the shop, past the table where Luca sat, past Marco and his leather portfolio, past the invisible boundary that separated her workspace from the dining area. She walked past Luca the way water flows around a stone, not avoiding him, not acknowledging him, simply continuing on a path that had been set before he arrived and would continue after he left. Her shoulder passed within 6 inches of his. The scent of bread and flour and something underneath, something clean and warm like linen dried in open air, crossed the space between them. She did not slow down. She did not speed up. She did not look at him. She unlocked the front door. She flipped the sign from closed to open. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the doorframe, looking out at Brewer Street, which was beginning its reluctant transition into day. Mrs. Alvarez was opening the dry cleaners. The kid from the bodega was sweeping the sidewalk, his headphones in, his broom moving in time to a rhythm no one else could hear. The light had shifted from that thin blade of gold to a broader, more democratic glow that reached both sides of the street equally. Behind her, Luca Ferraro stood up. It was not a response anyone expected, least of all Victor, whose job it was to expect everything. Luca Ferraro did not follow. He led. He sat, and the world arranged itself around his stillness. The idea that he would stand because a baker had walked away from him was a violation of physics, a disruption in the natural order of Brewer Street that Victor processed the way a seismologist processes an anomalous reading, with quiet alarm and immediate recalibration. Luca took a step toward the door, then another. He was not following her. That word implies pursuit, implies a predator-prey dynamic that did not apply here. He was moving toward something he did not yet understand, pulled by a force he had not felt in so long that he had forgotten it existed. Curiosity. Not the strategic curiosity of a man assessing an asset. The other kind. The kind that has no profit margin. The kind that gets you killed in his world. He stopped behind her. Not close. Not the distance of intimidation. The distance of attention. 3 feet. The space between two people who are acknowledging each other's existence without yet acknowledging their interest. "Your bread," he said. Elena turned. She was backlit by the morning light, the contours of her face half-lit, half-shadowed, the flour on her jaw catching the gold like a dusting of something precious. She looked at him with those gray eyes, and in them was something he had not seen directed at him in longer than he could remember. Indifference. Genuine, unperformative, absolute indifference. Not the practiced deference of people who feared him. Not the calculated warmth of people who wanted something from him. Not the theatrical defiance of people who were trying to prove a point. She simply did not care who he was. He existed in her bakery the way the tables existed, the way the flour existed, as a feature of the environment, relevant only if he became useful. "What about it?" she said. "It is exceptional." She did not thank him. A different kind of woman, a woman who operated within the social economy that Luca understood and controlled, would have softened, would have smiled, would have offered a sample, initiated conversation, leveraged the compliment into a connection. Elena did none of these things. She nodded once. It was the same nod she gave Mrs. Okonkwo. The nod that said, "I know." She walked back to her counter. The baguettes needed checking. Luca stood in the doorway of a bakery he owned, watching her go. Behind him, the morning air carried the sounds of Brewer Street waking, the rattle of a delivery truck, the hiss of a hydrant cap being tested, the distant argument of pigeons on a roofline. Victor stood by the car, his face professionally blank, but his posture had changed in a way that only Marco would notice. He was recalculating whatever this visit had been supposed to accomplish, and Victor knew exactly what it had been supposed to accomplish, because he had seen the architectural renderings in Marco's portfolio. The plans to convert this block of storefronts into a unified commercial space under a single brand, a plan that required every leaseholder to capitulate or be replaced. That objective had just become significantly more complicated. Marco appeared at Luca's shoulder. He did not speak. He had worked for Luca long enough to know that certain silences were not invitations to fill them. This was one of those silences. It had the particular density of a silence that was doing the work of several simultaneous thoughts, none of which Marco was authorized to interrupt. Luca turned and walked to the car. He did not look back at the bakery. He did not need to. He had already memorized it. The scarred marble, the rebuilt oven, the woman with flour on her jaw who had turned her back on him with the casual sovereignty of a queen dismissing a petitioner. He got into the car. Victor closed the door. The engine, which had been running the entire time, pulled the Mercedes away from the curb with the smooth, silent authority of a predator resuming its patrol. Inside the bakery, Elena pulled the baguettes from the oven. They were perfect. She knew they would be. She set them on the rack and began to prepare the display case for the day, placing each loaf with the same careful attention she gave to every task, whether or not anyone was watching. The bell above the door rang. A customer entered. She looked up. She served. The morning continued. She did not think about the man in the charcoal suit. She did not replay the moment or analyze the interaction or wonder what it meant. She had work to do. The rye needed to start its second proof. The walnut loaves needed scoring. There were orders to fill and dough to mix and a business to run on margins thin enough to cut paper, and whatever a man with hand-lasted shoes wanted with her lease, she would deal with it when she had to, and not one moment before. But her hands, as she shaped the rye, pressed harder than necessary, and the lame, when she picked it up to score the walnut loaves, felt heavier than it had an hour ago. And the bell above the door, when the next customer entered, rang with a pitch that she heard differently now, though she could not have said why. 3 days passed, the bread continued. The oven ran hot on the left side, and she compensated. The morning light found the display case at 6:12, and the loaves glowed. Mrs. Okonkwo came. The regulars came. The rhythm of the bakery was a heartbeat, steady and sustaining, and Elena existed within it the way a musician exists within a tempo, not thinking about it, simply being it. On the 4th day, a woman arrived at the bakery at 11 in the morning. She wore a tailored pantsuit the color of slate and carried a briefcase that was newer than her confidence. She introduced herself as Diane Cortland, a representative of the property management company that held the lease for Elena's storefront. She produced papers. She sat at one of the mismatched tables and laid out the papers with the kind of careful arrangement that suggests a person who has been told that this meeting matters, and who is trying very hard to perform the gravity of the situation. The lease, Diane Cortland said, was up for renewal in 90 days. The property management company had received a development proposal for the block. The proposal involved significant renovation, unified branding, and a reorientation of the commercial spaces toward a higher margin tenant profile. In plain language, which Diane Cortland did not use, but which Elena translated instantly from the jargon, the bakery was being pushed out. The new rent would be triple the current rate. The terms would require conformity to a design standard that included specific fixtures, signage, and even product offerings. The bakery, as it currently existed, handmade bread, no coffee, no Wi-Fi, reclaimed wood and scarred marble, did not fit the profile. Elena stood behind the counter and listened. She did not sit. She did not pick up the papers. She let Diane Cortland finish, the way a doctor lets a patient finish describing their symptoms before delivering the diagnosis. When the woman was done, Elena asked a single question. "Who sent you?" It was not really a question. The inflection was flat, declarative, the verbal equivalent of the nod she gave Mrs. Okonkwo. She knew who sent her. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. Diane Cortland blinked. "The property management company represents the building's ownership group," she said. and the words came out rehearsed, buffed smooth by repetition, a sentence designed to obscure rather than reveal. Elena wiped her hands on her apron. She folded the towel. She placed it where it belonged. "Tell the ownership group," she said, "that I have a lease. It is valid for 90 days. In 90 days, we can discuss the renewal. Until then, I will be here." Making bread. Diane Cortland gathered her papers. She left the bakery with the careful, measured steps of a woman who had expected resistance, but not this particular kind. Not this wall of quiet, absolute certainty that had no cracks for negotiation to seep through. The bell rang. The door closed. Elena stood alone in her bakery and pressed her palms flat against the marble counter. The stone was cold. It was always cold, even when the oven had been running for hours, as though the marble remembered the church it came from and refused to be warmed by anything less than prayer. She stood there for a long time. The rye was proofing. The walnut loaves were cooling. The afternoon light had shifted from gold to a flatter, more honest gray that showed every crack in the brick, every patch of flour and epoxy, every year of stubborn, beautiful, precarious survival. 90 days. She had 90 days before Luca Ferraro's machine would grind her out of existence. She pulled out the rye. She shaped it. Her hands were steady. The information traveled the way all information travels in ecosystems of power, through Marco, filtered, contextualized, annotated with his own analysis, which was always correct in its facts and always insufficient in its understanding. She refused the terms, Marco said, standing in the office 3 blocks south with its 2-key, 1-code door and its leather chair and its view of nothing because the windows were frosted for security. She referenced the remaining lease period. She did not ask for a meeting. She did not ask for alternative terms. She told Cortland to leave. Luca was reading something on a tablet, or rather, he was looking at a tablet in the way that men of his particular authority look at things they are not actually seeing, because their mind is processing something else entirely. He did not respond to Marco immediately. The silence in the room was the functional silence of a man who was thinking, and Marco, well trained, did not fill it. The architectural plans for the block lay on the desk beside the tablet. They were clean, ambitious, and profitable. The block, reimagined as a unified retail space, would generate revenue that justified the investment. Every storefront had been accounted for. Every leaseholder had been contacted. Every single one had agreed to the new terms, accepted the buyout, or simply disappeared, because people on Brewer Street understood that when the ground shifts beneath you, you either move or you are buried. All except one. "Tell me about her lease," Luca said. Marco opened the portfolio. "Standard commercial lease," he said. "Signed 4 years ago. Below market rate at the time. She has never missed a payment, never requested maintenance, never filed a complaint. The only modification she has made to the space is the oven, which she rebuilt without authorization. Technically a lease violation, but it was never flagged." Luca set the tablet down. "The oven," he said. "She rebuilt it herself. Twice." Luca said nothing for 11 seconds. Marco counted because he had learned that the duration of Luca's silences correlated directly with the significance of his next decision. 11 seconds was longer than most. 11 seconds was the silence that preceded the Giordano restructuring. 11 seconds was the silence that preceded the decision to close the harborfront operation. 11 seconds meant that whatever came next would not be small. "I will go back," Luca said. Marco's face maintained its professional neutrality, but somewhere behind his eyes, a small alarm began to sound. Luca Ferraro did not go back. Luca Ferraro sent people. Luca Ferraro existed at the center of a system designed specifically so that he never had to go anywhere twice, never had to repeat himself, never had to invest personal attention in a problem that could be solved through delegation. A bakery lease on Brewer Street was not a matter that required the physical presence of Luca Ferraro. It was a matter that required a phone call at most. When, Marco asked, because asking why was not within his job description. Tomorrow, early. Marco noted the instruction. He did not note the word early, because Luca Ferraro did not do early. Luca Ferraro did not exist before 9 in the morning. The world before 9 belonged to other people, to workers, to commuters, to bakers who stood in flour-dusted kitchens before the city remembered they existed. The fact that Luca intended to enter that world, to rise before his natural hour and go to a bakery that would not serve him coffee, was a deviation from protocol significant enough that Victor, when informed, performed the physical equivalent of raising an eyebrow, which was to check his firearm. He arrived at 6:15. The Mercedes stopped. Victor emerged, scanned, opened the door. Luca stepped out into the early morning air of Brewer Street, and the cold hit him like a correction. He was accustomed to climate control. Offices, cars, restaurants, residences, all maintained at exactly the temperature that his comfort required. This air was not for his comfort. It was March air, raw and honest, carrying the smell of wet pavement and diesel, and, beneath it all, bread. The bread smell was different at this hour. It was deeper, less finished, the smell of dough in transformation, rather than the polished product that would sit in the display case later. It was the smell of labor in progress. He walked in alone. He told Victor to wait. This instruction was unprecedented. Victor waited. His hand did not leave the vicinity of his left arm. The bell rang. Elena was at the oven. She heard it. She did not turn. She was monitoring the sourdough, watching the crust through the oven's small clouded window, reading the color the way a jeweler reads the color of gold, with an expertise so deep it had become instinct. The crust was at minute 14 of a 22-minute bake. She would not move until minute 17, when she would crack the oven door to release the remaining steam and begin the final phase of caramelization. The footsteps behind her were not the footsteps of her morning regulars. Her regulars shuffled, scuffed, moved with the careless rhythm of people at home in a familiar space. These footsteps were measured, each one placed with the deliberation of a man who had been taught, or had taught himself, that how you move through a space tells everyone in it exactly who you are. She did not turn. She watched the bread. Luca stood in the middle of the bakery and watched her not turn. He was, for the second time in a week, being ignored by a woman with flour on her jaw, and the sensation was so unfamiliar that he was forced to examine it the way a doctor examines a new symptom, with clinical interest and a faint, alarming suspicion that it might be significant. The oven ticked. The dough expanded. The crust deepened. At minute 17, Elena cracked the door. A breath of steam escaped, carrying with it the concentrated essence of the sourdough. Tangy, complex, alive. She adjusted the angle of the door with a precision that came from 4 years of learning this particular oven's needs, its hotspots, its moods, its mechanical personality. She did not rush. The bread dictated the timeline. Everything else, including the man standing behind her, was secondary to the bread. At minute 22, she removed the loaves. She set them on the cooling rack. She closed the oven door. She stood for a moment with her back to him, her hands flat on the counter, and breathed. Then she turned. He was standing where she expected him to be, in the center of the room, equidistant from all walls, occupying space the way a monument occupies a plaza. He was wearing a different suit than last time, darker, almost black, with a shirt that was a shade of blue so pale it was nearly white. He had no portfolio, no intermediary, no Marco to speak the words he would not speak himself. He was alone, and in the small bakery, with its scarred marble and its bare brick and its rebuilt oven, he looked exactly like what he was, a man of immense power standing in a space where power meant nothing, where the only currency was flour and water and time and the knowledge of how to transform them. Elena wiped her hands. She met his eyes. The gray met the dark. Neither looked away. "I am not selling my lease," she said. "I am not accepting new terms. I am not closing. If that is why you are here, you have wasted a trip." The words were not angry. They were not defiant. They were factual, delivered with the same flat precision she used to check the oven temperature, the same calm certainty she brought to every loaf. This is the truth. The truth does not negotiate. Luca looked at her for a long time. The bakery was silent except for the cooling bread, which made small ticking sounds as it contracted, and the hum of the oven cycling down, and the distant sound of Brewer Street beginning to stir outside the locked door. Then he did something that would have made Marco drop his portfolio, and Victor draw his weapon if either of them had been present to see it. He sat down at one of the mismatched tables, folded his hands, and said, "Tell me about the bread." Elena stared at him. She searched his face for the angle, the strategic approach, the manipulation, the velvet-gloved method of extracting what the property lawyer had failed to extract. She found nothing. His expression was the same controlled mask it always was, but behind his eyes, in that deep shadow beneath the brow, something had changed. The predator was still there, but it had stopped hunting. It was listening. She did not sit down. She stood behind her counter, in her domain, and told him about the bread. She told him about the sourdough starter she had brought from Romania in a sealed jar in her carry-on luggage, a living culture descended from a starter her grandmother had maintained for 40 years in the bakery in Cluj-Napoca, fed with the same flour every 3 days, kept at the same temperature, spoken to in the same language, because her grandmother believed that bread listened, that the culture was alive, not just biologically, but spiritually, and that what you said to your dough mattered. She told him about the marble, how she had found it in a salvage yard, how she had recognized it as church marble by the grain and the veining and the way it held cold, and how she had hired 2 men and a truck to haul it into the shop, because marble remembers the temperature of the last thing that rested on it, and bread shaped on marble that remembers cold rises differently, slower, more evenly, with a finer crumb. She told him about the oven, how the Blodgett had arrived broken, missing its steam injection manifold and half its heating elements, how she had found the parts in Newark, how she had rebuilt it not once but twice, the second time because she understood its faults better than the first time, and wanted to correct not just the mechanical failures, but her own initial compromises. She told him that the oven ran hot on the left side, and that she compensated, and when she said compensated, the word carried the weight of a philosophy, that the response to imperfection was not replacement, but adaptation, not surrender, but adjustment, not the brute force of money thrown at a problem, but the quiet intelligence of a person who learns the specific, irreducible nature of her tools and works within their limitations to produce something that transcends them. She did not tell him about her grandmother. Not yet. She did not tell him about the bakery in Cluj-Napoca, or why it no longer existed, or why she had not been back in 11 years. Those were load-bearing walls in a structure he had no right to enter. Luca listened. He did not interrupt. He did not check a phone. He did not shift in his chair. He listened with the complete, annihilating focus of a man who had spent his life listening for lies and was hearing, for the first time in longer than he could remember, nothing but truth. She spoke about flour the way his father had spoken about loyalty. She spoke about her oven the way Victor spoke about weapons, with an intimacy that came from dependence, from survival, from the knowledge that this tool, if properly maintained and deeply understood, would not betray you. She spoke, and Luca Ferraro, who had sat across from politicians and killers, and bankers and bishops, and had never once been moved by their words, felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic displacement so deep and so unexpected that he mistook it, at first, for heartburn. "The display case," he said, when she had finished. "The morning light. You positioned it deliberately." Elena's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, with something closer to respect. He had noticed the one thing she had designed for beauty rather than function, the one concession to artistry in a space otherwise governed by pure utility. 6:12, she said. The light hits the center of the case. The scoring shadows make the loaves look like terrain maps. He almost smiled. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of one, a muscular memory of an expression he had not fully deployed in years, suppressed before it could fully form, because smiling, in his world, was a vulnerability, But it was there, in the micro-movement at the corner of his mouth, and Elena saw it. She saw it the way she saw the color of a crust at Minute 14, with the trained eye of someone who reads surfaces for the truth beneath them. The bell rang. Mrs. Okonkwo entered at 6:30, as she always did. She saw the man at the table. She did not react. She placed her money on the counter. Elena placed the bread in the bag. The nod was exchanged. Mrs. Okonkwo left. The bell rang. The morning continued. Luca stood. He straightened his jacket with a precision that was, for the first time in Elena's observation, unnecessary. A habitual gesture performed not out of need, but out of the need to do something with hands that had, for a moment, forgotten their purpose. "Your lease will not be altered," he said. "The terms remain as they are." Elena looked at him. She did not thank him. Thanking him would have implied that the outcome had been uncertain, that her continued existence in this space was a gift rather than a right. It was not a gift. It was a lease, paid in full, never late, and the fact that a man in a $3,000 suit had decided not to destroy her did not warrant gratitude. It warranted the same nod she gave Mrs. Okonkwo. She gave it. Luca walked to the door. He opened it himself. Another first. A small revolution in the daily protocol of his existence. Victor, standing on the sidewalk, registered the self-opened door with the same quiet alarm with which he had registered everything else about this visit. Luca stepped outside. The morning air hit him again, but this time it did not feel like a correction. It felt like something else. It felt like the air outside a bakery in which a woman had just told him the truth about bread, and in doing so, had told him the truth about something much larger, something he had been avoiding for years with the same determined focus with which she avoided compromise. He did not look back. He got in the car. The door closed. The Mercedes pulled away. But he came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. He did not announce himself. He did not bring Marco or Victor inside. He arrived at 6:15, entered alone, and sat at the same mismatched table, the one closest to the counter, the one from which he could watch her work. He did not order. On the second morning, she placed a piece of sourdough on the table in front of him without being asked, torn from a loaf with her hands, still warm from the oven. He ate it slowly, and the taste hit him with a specificity that was almost violent. The tang of the 140-year-old culture, the mineral depth of the church marble, the particular caramelization that came from an oven that ran hot on the left side, and a baker who compensated. On the third morning, he brought her coffee. Not from a chain. From a place in the West Village that roasted their own beans and served them in ceramic cups that were warm to the touch. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. She took it. She drank it standing because she had never, in 4 years, sat down during working hours. He did not ask her to sit. He had learned. On the fourth morning, she told him about her grandmother. The bakery in Cluj-Napoca had been called Pain d'Or, golden bread. Her grandmother, Maria Vasile, had opened it in 1961 with flour she bartered for, and an oven built from reclaimed brick. For 40 years it fed the neighborhood. Not just physically. It was a gathering place, a sanctuary, a room where people who had nothing else had bread and warmth, and the presence of a woman who believed that feeding people was a form of prayer. Maria Vasile kept her starter alive through 3 regimes, 2 economic collapses, and a winter in 1985 when the flour supply was cut to nothing for 6 weeks, and she kept the culture alive by feeding it potato water and whispering to it in the dark. Elena's voice when she spoke of her grandmother did not change in volume or pitch, but it changed in texture. It became something softer, more worn, like cloth that has been washed so many times it has lost its weave but gained a different kind of beauty. Luca heard it. He heard the love and the loss and the inheritance in that voice, and he recognized it because he too carried a voice inside him that sounded like that, the voice of his own father, a man who had built something from nothing and had taught his son that the most dangerous thing in the world was not violence or poverty or betrayal, but the loss of the code that makes a man rather than an animal. The bakery was sold, Elena said, after her grandmother died. Elena's mother, Maria's daughter, had inherited it, but she had no interest in bread, no interest in Cluj-Napoca, no interest in the daily discipline of a 4 a.m. start and a 12-hour stand. She sold it to a developer who turned it into a phone shop. The starter, which Maria had kept alive for 4 decades, was thrown away. Elena had been 16. She had stood outside the empty bakery on the day the sign came down and felt something inside her collapse. Not break because broken things can be repaired, but collapse, the way a building collapses when its load-bearing walls are removed, all at once, completely, into dust. But she had taken one thing. Before the sale, before the gutting, before the sign came down, she had gone into the bakery at 3 a.m, the hour at which her grandmother had always begun, and she had taken a jar of the starter. She had sealed it. She had carried it with her through 18 years and 4 countries, and 3 attempts to build a life that felt like something other than exile. The starter in her bakery on Brewer Street was the direct descendant of that jar. It was alive. It was the last living piece of Maria Vasile's legacy, and every loaf that came out of the rebuilt Blodgett oven carried within it the ghost of a bakery in Cluj-Napoca that no longer existed, kept alive by a woman who refused to let the culture die. Luca sat with this story. He did not offer comfort. He did not compare it to his own losses, which were different in scale and texture, but identical in their essential architecture. The collapse of a legacy, the death of a code, the long exile of a person carrying something precious in a sealed jar. He simply sat, and his presence in that small bakery, in that early morning hour, was itself a kind of recognition. He saw her, not the baker, not the tenant, not the woman who had ignored him. He saw the granddaughter, the inheritor, the keeper of the culture. That evening in the office with the frosted windows, Luca opened the file on the Brewer Street development. He looked at the architectural renderings, the clean lines, the unified branding, the optimized retail spaces designed to extract maximum value per square foot. He looked at the numbers, which were excellent. He looked at the projected returns, which were compelling. Then he closed the file. "Marco," he said. Marco appeared in the doorway with the speed of a man who was always 1 room away. "Remove the bakery from the development plan," Luca said. "The space is not available." Marco's face performed a complex negotiation between professionalism and confusion. "The block layout requires the full frontage," he said. "Without the bakery space, the architectural plan needs to be redesigned. The investor presentation is in 3 weeks. Then redesign it," Luca said. "Work around her. Work around her." 3 words that, in the context of Luca Ferraro's career, were as revolutionary as a constitutional amendment. Luca Ferraro did not work around anyone. The world worked around Luca Ferraro. Buildings, businesses, city council members, federal investigators, all of them had, at various points, been rearranged, redirected, or removed to accommodate his plans. The idea that a single bakery, operated by a single woman, would become a fixed point around which his plans would bend was a concession of such magnitude that Marco, for the first time in his tenure, asked the question he was not authorized to ask. "Why?" Luca looked at him. The silence lasted 7 seconds. 7 seconds was shorter than 11, but the quality was different. This was not the silence of strategic calculation. This was the silence of a man who knew the answer, but was not yet prepared to say it aloud, because saying it aloud would make it real, and real things, in his experience, were things that could be taken from you. "Because," Luca said, and then stopped. He turned back to the window that showed nothing. "Because some things should not be moved." Marco left. He redesigned the plan. He worked around her. The weeks passed. The mornings continued. Luca arrived at 6:15. Elena made bread. They existed in each other's presence the way 2 planets exist in a shared orbit. Not colliding, not diverging, simply moving through the same space with an awareness that altered both their trajectories. She told him about the flour she imported from a mill in Transylvania, and why the mineral content of that specific wheat produced a crumb structure that no American flour could replicate. He told her about the building, its history, how it had been a textile warehouse before the war, and how the original freight elevator still existed behind a sealed wall on the second floor. She told him about the scoring patterns her grandmother used, and how each one had a name and a meaning, and how the 5 diagonal slashes on a baguette were called les griffes du chat, the cat's claws, because her grandmother had learned to bake from a Frenchman who had a cat that slept on the flour sacks. He laughed. It was a single sound, low and brief, like a stone dropped into deep water, and Elena heard it and knew, with the certainty of a woman who reads surfaces for the truth beneath them, that this was not a sound he made often. It was not a sound his world permitted. Laughter required vulnerability, and vulnerability in the ecosystem he inhabited was the one luxury that could not be purchased. On a Tuesday morning in April, 5 weeks after his first visit, Elena came out of the back room carrying a tray of baguettes and found Luca standing not at his usual table, but at the counter. He was looking at the sourdough in the display case with an expression she had not seen before. Not assessment, not admiration, but something closer to reverence. "Teach me," he said. She stared at him. He stood in his 3-piece suit, his hand-lasted shoes, his burgundy tie, and he was asking to learn how to make bread. The request was absurd. It was also, she understood immediately, completely sincere. He was not performing humility. He was experiencing it, the genuine, disorienting vulnerability of a man who had spent decades mastering the world and was now standing before a skill he could not buy, delegate, or command. She should have said no. Every practical instinct told her to say no. This man was still her landlord. He still owned the block. The power differential between them was a canyon, and every moment she spent in his presence was a moment spent on the edge of it, and edges, she knew from experience, were where people fell. She pulled an apron from the hook behind the counter. It was her grandmother's apron, brought from Cluj-Napoca, along with the starter, white cotton worn thin at the corners, stained with 40 years of flour. She held it out to him. Luca looked at the apron. He looked at her. He took off his jacket. He folded it with the same precision with which he did everything, and placed it on the chair. He took the apron. He put it on. The ties were too short. He was broader than her grandmother had been, and he had to knot them at the front instead of wrapping them around. He looked, in that moment, like the most dangerous pastry chef in the history of organized crime. Elena did not smile, but something in her eyes shifted, a warmth that had been sealed away behind the gray, like sunlight behind winter clouds. She taught him to knead. She stood beside him at the marble counter and placed his hands on the dough, hands that had signed orders and shaken on deals and done other things that neither of them spoke about. And she showed him the motion. Fold, stretch, quarter turn. Fold, stretch, quarter turn. His hands were wrong at first, too aggressive, treating the dough like something to be conquered rather than coaxed. She corrected him without words, placing her hands over his and guiding the pressure, teaching the restraint that was the foundation of everything: bread, power, love. The dough, she said, does not respond to force. It responds to patience. Her voice was quiet. Her hands were warm. The flour rose between them like a shared secret. He learned. Not quickly, not with the brutal efficiency with which he had mastered every other domain of his life, but slowly, humbly, with the stumbling grace of a man rediscovering a version of himself that had been buried beneath decades of armor. His first loaf was dense, underproofed, lopsided. She placed it on the rack with the same gentleness she gave to all her bread, and he looked at it with an expression that would have terrified his competitors. Because it was the expression of a man who cared about something small and imperfect and entirely outside his control. "It is not good," he said. "It is bread," she said. "It does not need to be good. It needs to be honest." Something passed between them then. Not a look. They were both looking at the lopsided loaf. Not a touch. Her hands had returned to her own counter. Something else. An alignment. A recognition. The baker and the man who owned the building, and the block and the machinery of a shadow world that operated by different laws than flour and water and time. They stood in a small bakery on Brewer Street, in the hour before the city woke, and they recognized in each other the same essential thing. The code, the inheritance, the thing that cannot be bought or sold or taken, only kept alive through daily practice, through discipline, through the stubborn refusal to let the culture die. Outside, Brewer Street was changing. The block development was proceeding, redesigned around the bakery, like a river redesigned around a stone. New storefronts were opening, a wine bar, an artisanal grocer, a small gallery, each one selected by Marco, with an attention to quality that was new, that felt different from the usual calculus of maximum extraction. The bakery sat among them, unchanged, unrenovated, its reclaimed wood sign and its hand-patched brick wall and its rebuilt oven a stubborn monument to a different kind of value. And every morning at 6:15, a black Mercedes stopped on Brewer Street, and a man stepped out who had once told the world to sit and watched as the world sat. And now he walked through a copper-belled door into a room that smelled of sourdough and steam and the ghost of a bakery in Cluj-Napoca, and he tied an apron that was too small for him, and he stood beside a woman who had never once done what he told her to do, and he learned. He learned that bread, like power, is a living thing. It demands respect. It punishes arrogance. It rewards patience. And it cannot be made by a person who does not know, in their hands and in their bones, the difference between commanding a thing and understanding it. Some mornings, when the light hit the display case at exactly 6:12 and the loaves glowed like relics, he stood beside her and watched the gold move across the bread, and neither of them spoke. And the silence was not the silence of his office, or his car, or his world of frosted windows and sealed doors. It was the silence of the bakery at dawn, the silence of dough rising, the silence of two people standing together in a room that smelled of flour and truth, recognizing that the strongest foundations are not built from marble, or money, or the machinery of fear, but from the daily, stubborn, ordinary act of making something good with your hands and refusing, no matter who walks through the door, to be anything less than what you are.